Black woman asked to prove her first-class ticket. Then she reveals she's a Supreme Court justice. The late afternoon sun streamed through the airplane windows as passengers filed into the cabin, dragging their carry-ons and bumping shoulders in the narrow aisle. The usual chaos of boarding was in full swing, people struggling with overhead bins, checking and double-checking seat numbers, and apologizing as they squeezed past each other. In first class, Brenda Monroe took her time settling into seat 2A, placing her leather briefcase under the seat in front of her. At 58, she moved with the kind of confidence that came from decades of commanding courtrooms and making decisions that shaped the nation. Her dark suit, though clearly expensive, was chosen for comfort rather than show. She'd learned long ago that 14-hour days required practical choices. "Would you like a pre-flight drink, ma'am?" A flight attendant appeared at her elbow with a practiced smile. "Just water, thank you," Brenda replied, pulling out her reading glasses. The past week at the Supreme Court had been particularly demanding, with a case that had captured national attention. The media cameras and constant scrutiny had left her craving these small moments of anonymity. She watched as other first-class passengers found their seats, noticing the subtle glances thrown her way. After 30 years in the legal system, Brenda had developed a sixth sense for these looks, some curious, others questioning, a few disapproving. She'd seen them all before in courtrooms, restaurants, and yes, plenty of first-class cabins. Opening her notebook, Brenda began reviewing her notes from the week's proceedings. The case involved environmental regulations and corporate responsibility, the kind of complex issue that kept her up at night, weighing precedents against progress, tradition against change. Her neat handwriting filled page after page, thoughts and questions carefully organized. A businessman in a navy suit took the seat across the aisle, doing a double-take as he sat down. Brenda kept her eyes on her work, but she could feel his gaze lingering. She'd mastered the art of appearing absorbed in her task while remaining acutely aware of her surroundings, a skill that had served her well both in and out of the courtroom. The cabin gradually filled with the sounds of pre-flight activity, the click of seatbelts, the thud of overhead bins closing, the murmur of conversations. A child somewhere in coach was asking loudly about when they would see the clouds. The familiar announcements began playing over the speakers, but Brenda barely registered them, focused instead on a particularly thorny point of constitutional interpretation. She'd chosen this flight specifically for its timing, hoping to use the 3 hours to organize her thoughts before Monday's session. At home, there would be calls to return, emails to answer, and a stack of briefs waiting for her attention. But here, suspended between cities, she could think without interruption. The water arrived, and Brenda took a small sip, careful not to spill as the plane began pushing back from the gate. She'd learned to appreciate these moments of forced pause in her otherwise relentless schedule. No phones, no clerks rushing in with urgent questions, no media waiting outside her chamber door. Several rows ahead, 2 passengers were having an animated discussion about a recent sports game. Their voices carried despite their attempts to keep their conversation private, and Brenda found herself smiling slightly at their enthusiasm. It was refreshing to hear people debating something other than constitutional law or federal regulations. A flight attendant passed by, checking seatbelts, and Brenda noticed how his eyes lingered on her just a fraction too long. She was used to this too, the subtle double-takes, the slight hesitation in people's manner when they saw her in spaces they didn't expect. Even after decades on the bench, even after making history as only the 3rd Black woman to serve on the Supreme Court, these moments still occurred with surprising regularity. The plane taxied slowly toward the runway, and Brenda took another sip of water, letting her mind drift back to the week's arguments. The corporate lawyers had been well prepared, their arguments polished to a shine. But there was something about the environmental group's presentation that kept nagging at her, a detail in their historical precedents that deserved another look. She pulled out her phone to switch it to airplane mode, catching a glimpse of the dozens of notifications that had accumulated in just the past hour. Her clerk had sent several emails about Monday's schedule, and there were messages from her daughter about Sunday dinner plans. All of it would wait until she landed. The engines roared to life, and Brenda felt the familiar push back into her seat as the plane accelerated. She'd never quite gotten used to takeoffs, But she'd learned to appreciate them as moments of forced transition, leaving one set of responsibilities behind, if only temporarily, before picking up another. As they climbed into the late afternoon sky, Brenda noticed a young girl, maybe 7 or 8, walking past with her mother toward the bathroom. The child's eyes went wide when she saw Brenda, and she tugged on her mother's sleeve, whispering something. The mother glanced over, recognition flickering across her face, and gave Brenda a respectful nod. These moments of recognition had become more frequent lately, especially after the high-profile cases of the past term. Brenda returned the nod with a warm smile, remembering her own daughter at that age, full of questions about her mother's work. Now that daughter was a civil rights attorney herself, carrying on the family tradition of seeking justice through the law. The plane leveled off, and the seatbelt sign dinged off. Brenda adjusted her seat slightly and returned to her notes. The environmental case wasn't just about regulations. It was about the balance between progress and preservation, between corporate interests and community needs. These were the kinds of cases that reminded her why she'd chosen this path, despite all the challenges and sacrifices it demanded. The cabin settled into the quiet rhythm of cruise flight. Someone ahead was watching a movie on their laptop, the faint sound of dialogue barely audible. The businessman across the aisle had fallen asleep, his newspaper forgotten in his lap. Brenda appreciated these moments when she could blend into the background, just another passenger on just another flight. She pulled out a legal brief she'd been meaning to review, the familiar language of judicial precedent and constitutional interpretation filling the pages. But before she could begin reading, movement in the aisle caught her attention. One of the flight attendants was approaching, his expression professional but with an undertone that Brenda had learned to recognize all too well. Mark Stevens had been a flight attendant for 12 years, and he prided himself on knowing how to handle any situation. He dealt with drunk passengers, medical emergencies, and every type of complaint imaginable. But something about this particular first-class cabin felt off to him today, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. He adjusted his navy tie as he approached row 2, where a black woman sat alone, absorbed in what looked like legal documents. Her presence had been nagging at him since boarding. First class wasn't exactly diverse on this route, and something about her quiet confidence made him uneasy in a way he didn't want to examine too closely. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, trying to keep his voice steady and professional. The woman looked up, her reading glasses perched on the bridge of her nose. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, but I need to verify all first-class tickets today. Would you mind showing me your boarding pass?" Brenda had been deep in thought about a particularly complex legal argument when the shadow fell across her papers. She'd been in this situation enough times to recognize it immediately, the forced politeness, the subtle implications. Taking a slow breath, she reached for her bag. "Of course," she replied, her voice carrying the same measured tone she used in court. She produced her boarding pass, crisp and unmarked, and handed it to Mark. Other passengers pretended not to watch, but she could feel their attention shift toward the interaction. Mark studied the boarding pass longer than necessary, his fingers tapping against the paper. The seat number matched, the date was correct, but something still felt wrong to him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to investigate further, even as a small voice in his head warned him to stop. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but would you happen to have the credit card you used to purchase this ticket? We've had some issues with fraudulent purchases lately." The excuse sounded weak even to his own ears, but he pressed on. "It's just a routine check." Brenda's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. She'd heard variations of this excuse countless times over the years, at hotels, at restaurants, and yes, on planes. Each time, she had to decide how to respond, weighing the cost of confrontation against the importance of standing her ground. The businessman across the aisle had woken up and was watching the interaction with poorly concealed interest. A couple in the row ahead had stopped their conversation, their heads tilted slightly to listen. The cabin's atmosphere had shifted, becoming charged with unspoken tension. "I don't have the card with me," Brenda said calmly, maintaining eye contact with Mark. "But I can assure you the ticket is legitimate." Her voice carried the weight of authority she developed over decades on the bench, though Mark didn't yet understand its source. Mark shifted his weight, uncomfortable but unwilling to back down. "I understand, ma'am, but without the card, I might need to." He paused, realizing he didn't actually know what he needed to do. There was no real policy about credit card verification after boarding. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the steady hum of the engines. Other flight attendants moved through the cabin, serving drinks and collecting trash, but they gave Mark's situation a wide berth. They could sense the tension building, even if they couldn't hear the quiet exchange. Brenda watched Mark's internal struggle play out across his face. She'd seen this before, the moment when someone realized they'd acted on assumptions they weren't proud of, but didn't know how to back down gracefully. Her years on the bench had taught her to read people's expressions like others read books. "Is there something specific about my ticket that concerns you?" she asked, her tone remaining professional but with an edge that made Mark flush slightly. The question hung in the air between them, loaded with unspoken implications. A baby started crying somewhere in coach, the sound drifting forward into the first-class cabin. Mark glanced around, perhaps hoping for backup or an escape route, but found neither. The other passengers were very deliberately looking anywhere but at him, though their attention remained fixed on the scene. "No, ma'am, it's just that we need to be sure." His voice trailed off as he realized how weak his position had become. The boarding pass was still in his hand, perfectly valid and legitimate. He had no real reason to doubt it, and they both knew it. Brenda reached into her bag again, this time deliberately taking her time. The movement was unhurried, almost casual, but it carried a purpose that made Mark stand straighter. She could have ended this immediately by showing her credentials, but sometimes these moments needed to play out. "I fly this route regularly," she said, her voice carrying just far enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Usually on Mondays and Thursdays, depending on the court schedule." She emphasized the word court slightly, watching Mark's expression for recognition. The businessman across the aisle sat up straighter, a look of dawning comprehension crossing his face. He'd been trying to place where he knew her from, and the pieces were finally coming together. His movement caught Mark's attention, making him glance between the passenger and Brenda with growing uncertainty. A flight attendant at the front of the cabin called Mark's name softly, probably needing help with the drink service, but he seemed rooted to the spot. Sweat had begun to form on his forehead, and his grip on the boarding pass had tightened enough to create small creases in the paper. "I understand you're doing your job," Brenda continued, her tone softening slightly. "But I think we both know this isn't about the ticket." The statement wasn't accusatory. If anything, it was almost gentle, but it carried the weight of decades of similar experiences. Mark's face flushed deeper, and he started to stammer out a response, but Brenda held up her hand in a gesture that had silenced many a lawyer mid-argument. The authority in that simple movement was unmistakable, and Mark fell quiet immediately. The overhead lights flickered briefly as the plane hit a patch of turbulence, making the ice in abandoned drink glasses clink softly. Mark was still standing there, Brenda's boarding pass crumpled slightly in his increasingly sweaty grip. The moment stretched out, becoming almost painful in its awkwardness. "I've been flying first class for over 20 years, Brenda said, keeping her voice low enough that only Mark and perhaps the closest passengers could hear. "And I've had this conversation more times than I care to count. Would you like to know why that is?" Mark swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. The question wasn't really a question, and they both knew it. A younger flight attendant walked past, shooting Mark a concerned look, but he barely noticed. His world had narrowed to this moment, this interaction that was rapidly spinning out of his control. I'm just following procedure," he managed to say, though his voice had lost its earlier certainty. The words sounded hollow even to his own ears, and he saw something like disappointment flicker across Brenda's face. "Are you?" she asked simply. "Have you asked to see anyone else's credit card today?" Her eyes moved deliberately to the businessman across the aisle, then to the couple in front of her, before returning to Mark's face. The implications hung in the air like smoke. Mark opened his mouth, then closed it again. He looked down at the boarding pass in his hand as if seeing it for the first time, noticing how unnecessarily long he'd been holding it. A call button chimed somewhere behind them, its friendly ding seeming almost absurd in the tension of the moment. Mark shifted his weight again, suddenly very aware of his uniform, his position, and the eyes of other passengers on him. I should probably check on. He began, gesturing vaguely toward the back of the plane, but Brenda wasn't finished. She reached into her bag once more, this time pulling out a small leather wallet. The movement was unhurried, almost casual, but it commanded attention. "Before you go," she said, "I think there's something you should see." Her tone hadn't changed. It remained calm, professional, almost kind, but there was an undercurrent of something else now. Not anger, not exactly, but perhaps a tired determination. Mark felt rooted to the spot as Brenda opened the wallet, revealing a gleaming metal badge. The Supreme Court seal caught the cabin light, instantly recognizable even to those who might not follow politics closely. A small gasp came from somewhere behind him, probably one of the passengers who'd been pretending not to watch. The badge wasn't just a symbol of authority, it was a mirror, reflecting back all the assumptions and biases that had led to this moment. Mark stared at it, his face draining of color as the full weight of his actions began to sink in. "Justice Monroe," he whispered, the title escaping his lips before he could stop it. His hands began to shake slightly, and he had to resist the urge to take a step backward. The boarding pass, still clutched in his hand, now felt like it was burning his fingers. The reality of the situation crashed over Mark like a wave. Here he was, questioning the credentials of a Supreme Court justice, all because he'd made assumptions he wasn't proud to examine too closely. The shame of it made his chest tight. "I didn't," he started, then stopped, realizing there was no good way to finish that sentence. "I didn't know. I didn't mean to." None of it mattered now, and Brenda's steady gaze told him she'd heard every possible excuse before. The businessman across the aisle was now openly staring, his newspaper completely forgotten in his lap. The couple in front had twisted around in their seats, no longer pretending to mind their own business. The quiet bubble of tension had expanded to encompass the entire first-class cabin. "Your boarding pass," Brenda said quietly, holding out her hand. Her nails were neatly trimmed, practical, the hands of someone who spent their days handling important documents and making crucial decisions. Mark placed the crumpled paper in her palm, noticing how his own hand trembled. "Thank you for your diligence," she said, smoothing out the creases in the boarding pass before tucking it back into her bag along with her badge. The words could have been sarcastic, but somehow they weren't. Instead, they carried a weight of experience, of countless similar interactions handled with the same careful grace. Mark stood there for a moment longer, words of apology stuck in his throat. The drink cart rattled somewhere behind him, a reminder that he had a job to do, passengers to serve. But leaving felt impossible, like running away from a mess he'd created. "I believe someone pressed their call button," Brenda said, her tone making it clear that the conversation was over. She picked up her legal papers again, adjusting her reading glasses in a gesture that seemed to reset the entire interaction. Mark nodded jerkily and turned away, his face burning. As he moved down the aisle, he could feel the eyes of other passengers following him, their gazes heavy with judgment. He'd been so sure he was doing his job, following some unwritten protocol, but now each step felt like a retreat. Behind him, Brenda returned to her reading, her posture as composed as ever. But her mind wasn't on the legal briefs anymore. Instead, she was thinking about all the times she'd had to make this choice, to educate or to ignore, to confront or to let it slide. Each time required a calculation, the energy it would take, the impact it might have, the cost of staying silent versus speaking up. The plane continued its journey through the afternoon sky, the engines humming steadily. In first class, the regular rhythm of the flight slowly resumed. Ice clinking in glasses, quiet conversations, the rustle of newspapers. But something had shifted, something important had been witnessed, and no one who'd seen it would forget it anytime soon. And Mark? He'd make his way to the back of the plane, his hands shaking slightly as he helped with drink service, his mind replaying every moment of the interaction. He had some thinking to do, some hard questions to ask himself. But for now, he had a job to finish, even if everything about it felt different than it had just minutes before. The overhead speakers crackled with a pilot announcement about weather conditions, drawing everyone's attention momentarily upward. When they looked back down, the moment had passed, but its effects would linger on. After this flight ended, the Supreme Court badge sat heavily in Brenda's hand as she considered her next move. She hadn't wanted to use it, had grown tired of needing to prove herself in spaces where others moved freely. But sometimes these moments called for more than quiet dignity. They required a gentle but firm reminder of the world's complexities. Mark still hadn't moved from her row, his presence lingering like a shadow. His earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by a deer-in-headlights look that Brenda had seen countless times before. It was the look of someone whose worldview was being reorganized in real time. Mark started again, his voice barely above a whisper. The badge caught the light from the window, sending small reflections dancing across the cabin ceiling. A few rows ahead, a passenger had turned completely around in his seat, no longer pretending not to watch. Brenda took off her reading glasses, folding them carefully before speaking. "You know," she said, her voice carrying just far enough to reach those nearby, "I've found that assumptions are interesting things. They tell us more about the person making them than the person they're made about." The words landed softly, but with impact. A flight attendant passing by slowed her pace, catching the edge of the conversation. The businessman across the aisle had closed his newspaper entirely, all pretense of reading abandoned. "Justice Monroe, I had no idea." Mark's words tumbled out, tripping over each other. His name tag, perfectly straight when he'd first approached, had gone slightly askew, and his earlier professional demeanor had crumbled completely. "That's rather the point, isn't it?" Brenda replied, her tone remaining measured. "We rarely have any idea about the people we meet, yet we make decisions about them in seconds." She placed the badge on her tray table, letting it rest there like a small but powerful reminder of the assumptions Mark had made. The cabin air felt thick with tension, the usual white noise of the engine somehow both too loud and too quiet. A child's laugh from coach class cut through the atmosphere briefly, a reminder of the normal world continuing just behind the curtain divider. "Please," Mark said, his voice steadying slightly, "I need to apologize. What I did was..." He paused, searching for the right words, but Brenda held up her hand again, that same gesture that had stopped countless arguments in her courtroom. "What you did," she said carefully, "was act on beliefs you might not have known you held. The question is, what will you do with that knowledge now?" Her words carried no anger, no accusation, just a gentle push towards self-reflection. The badge continued to gleam on the tray table, impossible to ignore. Other passengers were stealing glances at it, then at Brenda, then at Mark, connecting dots they hadn't seen before. The quiet murmur of recognition spread through first class like a ripple in still water. "I've served on the Supreme Court for 8 years, Brenda continued, her voice taking on the same tone she used when mentoring young law clerks. "Before that, I spent 20 years as a federal judge. And yet, here we are, having this conversation about whether I belong in this seat." Mark's face flushed deeper, the red creeping down his neck and disappearing into his collar. Behind him, another flight attendant hovered uncertainly, clearly wanting to help but unsure how to intervene in this delicate situation. "The thing about moments like these," Brenda said, picking up the badge and turning it over in her hands, "is that they're opportunities. Not just for me to prove my right to be here, but for all of us to examine why such proof seems necessary in the first place." A slight tremor ran through the plane, making the ice in abandoned drinks shift and clink. The sound seemed to break something in Mark's carefully maintained facade, and his shoulders slumped visibly. "I never meant to," he began, but stopped himself. "No, that's not right. I didn't think about what I was doing at all, did I?" The question seemed directed more at himself than at Brenda, but she nodded slightly in acknowledgement. The couple in front had given up all pretense of not listening, their heads turned to catch every word. Even the flight attendant who had been hovering nearby had stopped pretending to arrange things in her cart, standing still to absorb the moment. "In my courtroom," Brenda said, her voice warming slightly, "we deal with big questions, constitutional rights, federal laws, the shape of justice itself. But sometimes the most important changes happen in small moments, on planes and in restaurants, and in all the ordinary places where people meet and make choices about how to see each other. She picked up the badge again, this time holding it out so Mark could see it clearly. Not as a symbol of authority or shame, but as a bridge between assumption and understanding. His hands shook slightly as he looked at it, really looked at it this time. The afternoon sun slanting through the windows had shifted slightly, casting long shadows across the cabin. Somewhere behind them, a drink cart rattled, the sound oddly normal in the charged atmosphere. Mark's tie, slightly loosened now, moved gently in the air from the overhead vent. "You know what the hardest part of my job is?" Brenda asked, though it wasn't really a question expecting an answer. "It's not the complex legal arguments or the weight of precedent. It's remembering that every decision we make affects real people, in real moments, just like this one." The badge caught the light again as she returned it to her bag, the movement deliberate and unhurried. A phone chimed somewhere in the cabin, the sound seeming almost intrusive in the moment's gravity. "Justice Monroe," Mark said, finally finding his voice again. "I don't know how to make this right." The words came out quietly, almost broken, but they were honest, perhaps the first truly honest thing he'd said since approaching her seat. Brenda's expression softened slightly. Making it right isn't about this moment anymore. It's about all the moments that come after. It's about questioning those instant judgments we make about people before we know their stories. The businessman across the aisle cleared his throat, drawing a few glances. He'd been watching the entire exchange, his newspaper forgotten in his lap, and something in his expression suggested he was processing his own revelations. "I see hundreds of passengers every week," Mark said, more to himself than anyone else. "I never thought about. I didn't realize." He trailed off, words failing him again. "That's often how change begins," Brenda replied. "Not with grand gestures or dramatic moments, but with simple realizations. With questions we hadn't thought to ask before." She adjusted her seat slightly, the leather creaking softly. The other passengers had grown still, absorbing every word. Even those who had been pretending to sleep had given up the pretense, their eyes open, their attention fixed on the quiet drama unfolding in their midst. A baby started crying somewhere in coach, the sound drifting forward like a reminder of the normal world continuing beyond this moment. Mark glanced back, perhaps grateful for the distraction, but Brenda wasn't quite finished. "Before you go," Brenda said, reaching into her bag one more time, "I'd like you to have something." She pulled out a small business card, cream-colored and embossed with a Supreme Court seal. It was the kind she usually reserved for law students and young attorneys who sought her mentorship. Mark stared at the card as if it might burn him, his confusion evident. Around them, the cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see how this unusual moment would conclude. "My clerk's email is on there," she explained, holding out the card. "If you'd like to learn more about what we do at the court, or if you'd like to bring a group of your colleagues for a tour, we can arrange that." The offer hung in the air between them, unexpected and transformative. With trembling fingers, Mark accepted the card. The simple act of taking it seemed to shift something in his posture, not exactly confidence returning, but perhaps the first glimpse of a path forward. "I don't deserve," he started, but Brenda shook her head. "This isn't about deserving," she said. "It's about learning, about growing. The same things I've spent my entire career trying to encourage in others." She paused, letting the words sink in. "The same things I'm still learning myself." The overhead speaker crackled to life with a pilot announcement about weather conditions ahead, the everyday interruption almost comical in its timing. A few passengers jumped slightly, drawn out of their focus on the scene before them. "Thank you," Mark managed, carefully tucking the card into his shirt pocket. The simple words seemed inadequate for the moment, but they were sincere. His eyes had lost their earlier panic, replaced by something more thoughtful. "You have other passengers to attend to," Brenda said gently, picking up her legal papers again. The dismissal was kind but clear. She'd given him a lot to think about, and now he needed space to process it. As Mark turned to leave, his movements still slightly unsteady, Brenda noticed how the other passengers watched him go. Their expressions had changed too, from the earlier judgment to something more complex, more contemplative. Perhaps they were examining their own assumptions, their own unquestioned beliefs. The sun had shifted again, painting long golden stripes across the cabin. The regular sounds of flight, ice clinking, quiet conversations, the steady hum of engines began to return, but they felt different now, as if the air itself had been changed by what had transpired. Brenda slipped her reading glasses back on, returning to her legal briefs. But her mind lingered on the interaction, on the small seed of understanding she hoped she'd planted. In her decades on the bench, she'd learned that justice wasn't just about grand decisions and legal precedents. Sometimes it was about these quiet moments of revelation, these small chances to bridge the gaps between people. The plane continued its journey through the afternoon sky, carrying not just passengers, but also the weight of this moment, a moment that might seem small in the grand scheme of things, but could ripple outward in ways none of them could predict. Just like the cases she heard in court, every interaction had the potential to change someone's world, even if only by degrees. Behind her, a flight attendant was explaining to another passenger why their drink service was running slightly behind schedule. The ordinary rhythm of flight was resuming, but something had shifted in this small corner of the world. And sometimes Brenda knew that was enough. The news traveled through first class like a whisper in church. A Supreme Court justice, here in 2A. The revelation transformed the cabin's atmosphere, turning what had been an ordinary flight into something memorable. Passengers who had been absorbed in their phones or laptops now found themselves stealing glances at Brenda, their expressions a mix of awe and embarrassment. Mark had retreated to the galley, but his absence seemed to amplify rather than diminish the impact of what had happened. Other flight attendants picked up the slack, moving through the cabin with exaggerated care, their service now tinged with an almost ceremonial quality. "Would you care for another water, Justice Monroe?" asked Sarah, a younger flight attendant with auburn hair who'd materialized at Brenda's side. Her voice carried a warmth that was genuine but nervous, like someone meeting their favorite author. "That would be lovely, thank you," Brenda replied, noting how the simple exchange drew the attention of nearby passengers. She'd grown used to this part, the way people's behavior shifted once they knew who she was, the sudden appearance of deference where there had been dismissal. The businessman across the aisle, who had watched the entire scene unfold, cleared his throat. "Justice Monroe," he ventured, his voice pitched low, "I feel I should apologize as well. I saw what was happening and said nothing." Brenda turned to him, taking in his expensive suit and carefully maintained appearance. "Silence can be its own kind of statement," she said quietly. "But recognition of that is the first step toward change." 2 rows ahead, a woman in a red blazer was furiously typing on her phone, probably sharing the story with friends or family. Brenda could almost predict the message. "You won't believe who's on my flight." She'd seen it before, had become accustomed to being an unexpected anecdote in strangers' lives. Sarah returned with the water, placing it carefully on Brenda's tray table with a fresh napkin. Her hands trembled slightly, betraying her nervousness. "Is there anything else you need, Justice Monroe? Anything at all?" The question carried more weight than a simple offer of service, as if Sarah was trying to make up for her colleague's earlier behavior. Brenda smiled gently, recognizing the genuine desire to do better, to be better. "This is perfect, thank you," she said, then added, "And please, just Brenda is fine." The words were meant to ease the tension, but they seemed to have the opposite effect, making Sarah's eyes widen slightly at the implied familiarity. The cabin's transformation continued, subtle but unmistakable. Conversations dropped to whispers, as if the passengers were suddenly aware they were sharing space with living history. A man in a polo shirt who had been watching sports on his tablet switched to reading news headlines, stealing occasional glances in Brenda's direction. From the back of first class, the sound of Mark's voice drifted forward as he explained something to another crew member in hushed tones. The word justice was just barely audible, followed by more whispers. The story was spreading through the crew now, each retelling adding another layer to the afternoon's drama. A young woman 2 rows back had pulled out her phone, presumably looking up Brenda's background. This happened often, people suddenly discovering her history, her decisions, the weight she carried in shaping American law. Their expressions would shift as they scrolled, understanding deepening with each new detail they uncovered. "I argued before you once," said a quiet voice from the row behind. Brenda turned to see a middle-aged man in wire-frame glasses leaning forward slightly. "Environmental protection case, 3 years ago. We lost, but your dissenting opinion was magnificent." Brenda remembered the case, a complex dispute about water rights and corporate responsibility. "The law isn't always aligned with what's right," she replied. "That's why dissenting opinions matter. They're messages in bottles for future justices." The conversation caught the attention of others nearby. A woman in her 30s, who had been pretending to read a magazine, lowered it slightly to listen. The businessman across the aisle had given up any pretense of returning to his newspaper. Sarah passed by again, this time moving more slowly, as if reluctant to interrupt. The other flight attendants had developed a similar pattern, their movements through the cabin becoming almost choreographed, designed to show respect without intrusion. Even the air felt different now, charged with a kind of reverence that hadn't existed before. The usual boundaries between strangers on a plane had shifted, redrawn by the presence of someone who helped shape the very laws that governed their lives. A light patch of turbulence rattled the drink cart in the galley, making ice cubes dance in abandoned glasses. The brief disruption seemed to break some of the tension, reminding everyone that they were, after all, just on an ordinary flight across ordinary skies. "My daughter's in law school," ventured a woman seated by the window, 2 rows ahead. She half-turned in her seat, her face bright with possibility. "She'd be so inspired to know. I mean, would it be okay if I took a picture?" Brenda had faced this question countless times, had learned to navigate the delicate balance between accessibility and boundaries. "Perhaps instead," she suggested, pulling out another business card. "She'd like to apply for our internship program? We're always looking for passionate young minds." The woman's eyes lit up as she accepted the card, handling it as if it were made of gold leaf rather than paper. Around them, other passengers shifted in their seats, perhaps hoping for similar opportunities to connect, to be part of this unexpected moment. Mark had reappeared briefly at the edge of the galley, his face still flushed but his posture different now, less defensive, more thoughtful. He watched as his colleagues moved through the cabin with their newfound awareness, perhaps seeing his own transformation reflected in their changed behavior. "Would anyone like coffee or tea?" another flight attendant asked, her voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been there during the initial service. The ordinary question seemed to ground the moment, returning a touch of normalcy to the cabin even as the undertones of revelation remained. Several passengers who had declined drinks earlier now accepted, using the opportunity to steal closer looks at Brenda. She noticed, but didn't acknowledge their attention, having long ago mastered the art of being simultaneously visible and removed. The lawyer who had mentioned arguing before her was now quietly explaining the significance of her role to a seatmate, his voice carrying just far enough to be heard. Her opinions on privacy rights alone have shaped the entire digital age. Brenda returned to her legal papers, but she remained aware of the ripples continuing to move through the cabin. It was always like this, the way knowledge of her position changed spaces, changed interactions, changed the very air around her. Sometimes it felt like a burden, other times like an opportunity. The sun had begun its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the cabin in softer shades of gold. A baby's laugh echoed from coach class, the sound somehow both out of place and perfectly timed in the still-charged atmosphere of first class. "My son wrote his thesis on your healthcare decision last year," shared an elderly gentleman who had been quiet until now. His voice carried a note of pride mixed with something like wonder. "He said your perspective on accessibility changed the whole framework of the discussion." Brenda nodded acknowledgement, remembering the months of research and deliberation that had gone into that decision. It was strange sometimes, hearing how her words rippled out into the world, touching lives she would never know. Sarah appeared again, this time carrying a fresh pot of coffee. "Would you like a refill, Justice?" "I mean, Brenda?" She caught herself, blushing slightly at the correction. The formal title still felt necessary to most of them, a barrier they weren't quite ready to cross. "Just water is fine," Brenda replied, noticing how even this simple exchange drew attention. Every interaction had become a performance of sorts, observed and noted by the audience of fellow passengers. The businessman across the aisle had pulled out his laptop, and Brenda caught a glimpse of her own face on a screen. He was reading about her previous decisions, perhaps trying to understand the weight of the presence beside him. It was strange, watching someone discover your life's work in real time. A flight attendant who hadn't been involved in the earlier incident approached with fresh blankets, offering them to first-class passengers. Her movements were more deliberate now, each gesture infused with a new awareness of the cabin's significance. "Thank you for how you handled that earlier," she whispered to Brenda while arranging a blanket over the armrest. "Mark's a good person, sometimes people need to learn." Brenda appreciated the comment for what it was, not just a defense of a colleague, but an acknowledgement of the teaching moment this flight had become. "We're all learning," she replied quietly. "Every day, in every interaction." The cabin settled into a new rhythm, different from before but no longer quite so tense. Passengers returned to their books and devices, though their attention remained split, aware of the history maker in their midst. The usual drone of airplane white noise took on a different quality, as if the air itself had been educated. Mark passed through once more, this time pushing the cart with collected trash. His movements were more measured now, each interaction with passengers carrying a weight of reflection. He didn't meet Brenda's eyes directly, but his changed demeanor spoke volumes. A teenager in the last row of first class had pulled out a textbook, a thick volume that looked like it might be about constitutional law. Whether it was homework he'd planned to do anyway, or inspired by the day's events wasn't clear, but the sight brought a small smile to Brenda's face. The plane continued its journey through the darkening sky, carrying not just its passengers, but also the weight of transformation. In the galley, flight attendants spoke in hushed tones about respect and assumptions. In their seats, passengers reflected on their own biases and beliefs. And in 2A, Brenda Monroe returned to her legal briefs, knowing that sometimes the most important judgments happen not in courtrooms, but in these quiet moments of human connection and growth. Outside the window, clouds drifted by, indifferent to the small but significant changes taking place within the metal tube that passed through them. Another hour of flight remained, time enough for more reflection, more quiet revelations, more subtle shifts in understanding. The cabin had become not just a space for travel, but a classroom of sorts, where lessons about dignity and respect were being learned in real time. As the flight entered its final hour, Mark emerged from the galley area, his uniform freshly adjusted and his name tag straightened. He'd spent the last 20 minutes rehearsing what he would say, encouraged by his fellow flight attendants to make things right. His hands clutched a set of premium drink vouchers, a small peace offering that felt wholly inadequate for the situation. The walk to seat 2A seemed longer than before, each step carrying the weight of his earlier actions. Other passengers watched his approach with mixed expressions, some sympathetic, others still judgmental. The cabin had become an arena of sorts, with everyone waiting to see how this next chapter would unfold. "Justice Monroe," he began, his voice steadier than he expected. "I wanted to formally apologize for my behavior earlier." He stood straight-backed, professional, as if delivering a prepared statement rather than speaking from the heart. Brenda looked up from her work, setting aside her reading glasses. She'd been expecting this moment, had seen it coming from the moment she revealed her identity. These formal apologies always came, wrapped in protocol and procedure, missing the deeper understanding she hoped to inspire. "Your presence on our flight is an honor," Mark continued, the words feeling rehearsed. "And my actions were completely inappropriate. Please accept these vouchers for future flights as a token of our sincere apology." He held out the vouchers, his hand trembling slightly. The businessman across the aisle had stopped typing on his laptop, his attention fixed on the scene unfolding beside him. Even the couple in front had tilted their heads slightly, listening while pretending not to listen. Brenda studied Mark's face, seeing beyond the professional mask to the turmoil beneath. "Sit down for a moment," she said, gesturing to the empty seat next to her. It wasn't a request so much as a gentle command, the kind that had guided countless lawyers and clerks toward better understanding. Mark hesitated, glancing toward the galley where his duties waited. "I shouldn't. I mean, I'm on duty," he stammered, but Brenda's steady gaze held him in place. "We have time," she said simply, and somehow those 3 words carried enough authority to make Mark slowly lower himself into the seat, still clutching the vouchers like a shield. The engine's hum filled the silence between them as Mark perched awkwardly on the edge of the seat. His uniform, pristine and professional, seemed at odds with his obvious discomfort. The vouchers in his hand crinkled slightly as his grip tightened. "You know," Brenda began, her voice low enough that only Mark could hear clearly, "I've received many apologies over the years. Some scripted, some sincere, all of them focusing on the moment rather than the mindset that created it." Mark's carefully prepared speech seemed to evaporate in his mind. The vouchers in his hand suddenly felt trivial, almost insulting in their inadequacy. A flight attendant passing by shot him a questioning look, but Brenda's presence kept her from interrupting. "I didn't mean to," Mark started, then stopped himself. "No, that's not right. I did mean to question your presence here. I just didn't understand why I felt the need to do that." The admission came out raw, unexpected even to him. A slight turbulence shook the plane, making the ice in nearby glasses clink. The sound seemed to punctuate Mark's words, underlining their significance. Around them, other passengers tried to appear absorbed in their own activities while straining to hear the conversation. "That's a more honest beginning," Brenda noted, her tone warming slightly. "Tell me, what made you approach my seat earlier? What was it about my presence here that felt wrong to you?" The question hung in the air between them, heavier than the vouchers still clutched in Mark's hand. He looked down at them, then slowly placed them on the tray table, as if setting aside a script that no longer served its purpose. "I've been doing this job for 12 years, he said slowly, speaking more to himself than to Brenda. "I thought I knew what first class looked like, who belonged here. And when I saw you," he trailed off, the realization of his own biases making his voice catch. The sun had shifted again, casting long shadows through the cabin. In the galley, another flight attendant was watching with concern, probably wondering if she should intervene. But Brenda's presence created a bubble of privacy around their conversation, keeping interruptions at bay. "When you saw me," Brenda finished for him, "I didn't match that picture in your head. Even though my ticket was valid, my clothes were appropriate, and my behavior was unremarkable." She wasn't angry or accusatory. If anything, her tone carried a hint of tiredness, as if she'd had this conversation many times before. Mark's face flushed again, but this time it wasn't just embarrassment. Something deeper was happening, a kind of understanding that went beyond the superficial apology he'd planned to deliver. "I keep thinking about how many times I might have done this before," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "How many passengers I've made feel unwelcome without even realizing what I was doing." A baby cried somewhere in coach, the sound drifting forward like a reminder of the world beyond their conversation. The vouchers lay forgotten on the tray table, their inadequacy as an apology now obvious to everyone within earshot. "That awareness," Brenda said, "is worth more than any formal apology or compensation voucher. It's the beginning of change." She picked up one of the vouchers, examining it briefly before setting it back down. "But it's only valuable if it leads to action." Sarah appeared in the aisle with a fresh round of water, hesitated when she saw Mark seated beside Brenda, then moved on without interrupting. The other passengers had grown quieter, as if sensing the importance of the conversation taking place in their midst. "I don't know how to fix this," Mark said, his earlier professional demeanor completely gone now. "How do I make up for years of not seeing what I was doing?" "You don't fix the past," Brenda replied, reaching into her bag again. She pulled out a small notebook, not her legal briefing, but something more personal. "You change the future. Every interaction, every assumption, every moment of hesitation, those are opportunities to do better." Mark watched as she wrote something in the notebook, her handwriting neat and deliberate. The businessman across the aisle had completely abandoned any pretense of work, his laptop closed as he listened to the exchange. I've spent my career making decisions that affect people's lives, Brenda continued, tearing the page from her notebook. But sometimes the most important changes happen in these small moments, these quiet realizations between two people. She handed the paper to Mark. It wasn't another business card or contact information. It was a list of book titles and authors, resources about unconscious bias and systemic change. Mark took it with trembling fingers, scanning the titles as if they were sacred text. "This isn't about making you feel guilty," Brenda explained, watching his reaction. "It's about understanding that we all carry these biases, these preconceptions. The question is what we do once we become aware of them." The overhead speaker crackled with an announcement about their approaching destination, making several passengers jump. The interruption seemed almost intrusive, breaking into the intimate sphere of their conversation. "Take those vouchers," Brenda said, nodding toward the forgotten papers on the tray table, "and give them to someone who looks like they don't belong in first class. Watch their reaction. Remember this moment." Mark picked up the vouchers again, but they felt different in his hands now, less like an apology and more like a tool for change. The formal speech he'd prepared seemed ridiculous now, empty words compared to this raw moment of understanding. "I should get back to..." He gestured vaguely toward the galley, starting to rise. The weight of his duties was calling, but something had shifted in how he viewed those responsibilities. "Yes," Brenda agreed, "but take this with you too." She handed him one final thing. Not a business card or a voucher, but a simple post-it note with a quote written on it. "Justice isn't just about the law. It's about how we see each other." Mark stood, tucking both the reading list and the post-it carefully into his shirt pocket, where earlier he'd stored her business card. His posture had changed, not exactly confident, but somehow more grounded, more aware. "Thank you," he said simply, and this time the words carried real weight. The formal apology he'd planned had transformed into something else entirely, not a resolution, but a beginning. As he walked back to the galley, the other passengers watched him go, many of them lost in their own thoughts about assumptions and judgments. The cabin felt different now, charged not with the earlier tension but with possibility. Brenda returned to her legal briefs, but her mind lingered on the interaction. She'd received countless formal apologies over the years, each one wrapped in protocol and procedure. But it was these moments of genuine understanding, these small transformations, that gave her hope for real change. The plane began its initial descent, the subtle shift in engine noise marking the beginning of their journey's end. But for Mark, and perhaps for others in the cabin who had witnessed the exchange, a different kind of journey was just beginning. As the plane began its gradual descent, the first-class cabin had become unusually quiet, filled with the kind of silence that comes after witnessing something significant. The usual shuffle of passengers preparing for landing was muted, replaced by thoughtful glances and half-finished conversations. The businessman across the aisle had closed his laptop for good, staring out the window with an unfocused gaze that suggested his mind was elsewhere. His fingers drummed absently on the armrest, a nervous habit that spoke of internal turmoil. "I've been flying first class for 20 years, he said suddenly, turning to Brenda. His voice was low, almost confessional. "And I've never once been asked to prove I belonged here." The realization seemed to pain him, as if he was seeing his own privilege clearly for the first time. 2 rows ahead, a woman in a designer suit was having an intense whispered conversation with her seatmate. I consider myself progressive," she was saying, her words carrying despite her attempt to keep them private. "But would I have questioned it too? If I were in his position?" The cabin had become a kind of confessional space, where passengers found themselves examining their own behaviors, their own unspoken assumptions. Some looked uncomfortable with what they were finding. Sarah, making her final rounds, moved more carefully now, hyper-aware of how she interacted with each passenger. Her usual confident efficiency had been replaced by a kind of thoughtful hesitation, as if each interaction was an opportunity to do better. "My daughter's in hospitality management," an elderly woman shared with her seatmate, loud enough for others to hear. "I need to call her tonight, tell her about this. There are things they don't teach in those courses, you know?" The setting sun cast long shadows through the cabin, painting everything in shades of gold and purple. The light seemed to soften the edges of the moment, making it easier for people to voice the thoughts they might usually keep hidden. In the galley, Mark was going through the motions of preparing for landing, but his movements were mechanical, distracted. Other crew members gave him space, recognizing that something fundamental had shifted in their colleague. "I keep thinking about last week's flight to Chicago," one flight attendant whispered to another, their conversation just barely audible. "Remember that group of teenagers? Did we? Were we fair about the seating arrangements?" The ripple effect of the afternoon's events continued to spread through the cabin. A young man in a tech company hoodie had pulled out his phone, typing rapidly. "Just wrote to our HR department," he mentioned to no one in particular. "We need to revise our training materials." Brenda observed it all quietly, her legal papers now tucked away in her bag. She'd seen this pattern before, the way one moment of confrontation could spark a chain reaction of self-reflection. Sometimes uncomfortable truths needed to be witnessed to be understood. A flight attendant who hadn't been involved in the earlier incident approached Brenda's seat, coffee pot in hand. Her name tag read Lisa, and her hands shook slightly as she spoke. "Would you like a final cup before we land, Justice Monroe?" But there was more in her eyes than a simple offer of coffee. "I've been doing this job for 5 years, she added softly, "and I'm realizing I need to unlearn some habits." The admission came with a kind of raw honesty that seemed to be spreading through the cabin like a gentle contagion. The businessman across the aisle cleared his throat again. "You know," he said, addressing Brenda, but speaking loud enough for others to hear, "I run a company with over 500 employees. And looking back now, I have to wonder about our hiring practices, our promotions, all the little decisions we make without really thinking." The plane hit a pocket of turbulence, causing the overhead bins to creak. The physical jolt seemed to mirror the emotional turbulence many passengers were experiencing as they confronted their own biases. A young woman who'd been quiet throughout the flight finally spoke up from her window seat. "I'm in law school," she said, her voice carrying a mix of admiration and embarrassment. "We study your decisions, Justice Monroe. But seeing this today, it's different than reading about discrimination in textbooks." The couple who had been witnessing everything from the row ahead turned around fully now, no longer pretending to mind their own business. "We own a small business," the woman said. "Just a cafe, but maybe we need to think about how we treat people who don't look like our usual customers." Mark passed through the cabin one last time, checking seatbelts for landing. His earlier confidence had been replaced by something more valuable: awareness. Each interaction was measured, thoughtful, as if he was seeing each passenger clearly for the first time. "My sister's a teacher," someone said from the back of first class. "She needs to hear about this." About how these moments shape people, how assumptions can hurt. The comment floated through the cabin, met with murmurs of agreement. Brenda noticed how the conversations had evolved over the course of the flight. What had started as shocked whispers about her presence had transformed into deeper discussions about privilege, bias, and the possibility of change. A baby laughed somewhere in coach, the sound providing a momentary break in the heavy atmosphere. Several passengers smiled reflexively, perhaps reminded that amidst all this serious self-reflection, life continued with its simple joys. "We're beginning our final descent," the captain's voice announced over the speakers. "Flight attendants, please prepare for landing." The routine words carried a different weight now, coming at the end of this transformative journey. Sarah made one final pass through the cabin, her movements more deliberate than before. She paused at Brenda's seat, not to offer service, but to share a thought. "My mother raised me to treat everyone equally," she said quietly. "But I'm realizing that's not enough. We need to actively question our assumptions." The city lights were becoming visible below, a carpet of twinkling dots spreading out beneath the plane. Passengers began the usual preparations for landing, tray tables up, seats forward, but there was a thoughtfulness to their movements that hadn't been there during takeoff. "I have a meeting with my board tomorrow," the businessman said, almost to himself. "Maybe it's time we had some difficult conversations about representation in upper management." He wasn't looking for approval or acknowledgement. It was simply a thought voiced aloud, a commitment made in the quiet of self-reflection. The woman with the law student daughter had pulled out her phone again, but this time she wasn't sharing the story of meeting a Supreme Court justice. Instead, she was making notes, writing down thoughts and questions about her own behaviors and assumptions. Mark appeared one last time, standing at the front of first class. His posture was different now, not defeated, but humbled. He caught Brenda's eye briefly, nodded once, then turned to assist with final landing preparations. The vouchers in his pocket remained untouched, transformed from a token apology into a reminder of this afternoon's lessons. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane descended through the clouds. In the softer light, passengers' faces showed the weight of their thoughts. Some looked tired, others determined, but all seemed changed by what they'd witnessed. "My grandson asks me sometimes why things are the way they are," an elderly man shared softly with his seatmate. "After today, I think I'll have a better answer for him. Not an easier one, but a better one." The landing gear deployed with a familiar thud, and the plane began its final approach. Brenda closed her eyes briefly, feeling the subtle shifts in altitude. She'd taken this flight countless times, but this journey had been different. Sometimes change happened in grand gestures and sweeping legal decisions. And sometimes it happened in quiet moments at 35,000 feet, when people were forced to confront their own reflections. The city grew closer below them, its lights becoming clearer, more distinct. Like the passengers' growing awareness, what had been a blur was coming into sharp focus. As the plane descended, carrying its cargo of transformed perspectives, Brenda thought about how change rarely announces itself with fanfare. Instead, it often arrives in these small moments of revelation, these quiet opportunities to see ourselves and others more clearly. The plane touched down with a gentle bump, its wheels finding purchase on the familiar runway. As the engines reverse thrust, pushing passengers forward in their seats, Mark stood in the galley, gathering his courage for one final interaction. The vouchers felt heavy in his pocket, but something else weighed even heavier, the need to make this last moment count. The airplane taxied slowly toward the gate, its movements accompanied by the soft dings of phones being turned on, the rustle of passengers gathering belongings, and the quiet murmur of conversation. But the usual rush to stand and retrieve bags was notably absent in first class. Instead, there was an unspoken agreement to let this final moment play out. When the seatbelt sign finally dinged off, Mark emerged from the galley, holding not just the vouchers but something else, a handwritten note he'd composed during the flight's quiet moments. His hands trembled slightly as he approached Brenda's seat, but his steps were purposeful. "Justice Monroe," he began, his voice steadier than before. "Before you leave." He paused, aware of the other passengers watching, but for once not minding the audience. This wasn't about performance anymore. Brenda looked up from gathering her belongings, her expression open but reserved. She'd seen many such final approaches over the years, had received countless last-minute apologies. But something in Mark's demeanor suggested this might be different. "I wanted to give you these back," he said, pulling out the vouchers. "Not because you don't deserve them, but because they're not the right response to what happened today." He placed them on her tray table, along with his handwritten note. The businessman across the aisle paused in collecting his laptop, watching the scene unfold. Other passengers similarly slowed their preparations for departure, sensing that this final exchange was important somehow. "Instead," Mark continued, his voice growing more confident, "I want you to know what I'm going to do with what I learned today." He gestured to the note, which Brenda now picked up and began to read. The note was simple but sincere, outlining specific steps Mark planned to take, organizing bias training for his flight crew, starting conversations about assumptions and service, keeping a journal of his own interactions to track his growth. It wasn't just promises, it was a plan of action. "I know it's not enough," he added as Brenda read, "but it's a start." Behind him, Sarah and Lisa watched from the galley, their own expressions reflecting similar commitments to change. Brenda folded the note carefully, considering her response. Around them, the cabin had grown quiet again, passengers pausing in their post-landing routines to witness this final moment of the journey. "You know what I look for in my courtroom, Mark?" she asked, tucking the note into her bag. Not just rules followed or procedures maintained, but genuine understanding. Growth. She looked up at him, her expression softening. "That's what I see here." The overhead bins creaked as someone opened one nearby, but nobody moved to leave. Even the passengers and coach, visible through the curtain divider, seemed to sense that something important was happening in first class. "I've been thinking about how many times I must have done this before," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. "How many passengers I made feel unwelcome without even realizing it. And I keep wondering about all the times nobody had the power to make me see what I was doing." A flight attendant from coach poked her head through the curtain, probably wondering about the delay, but quickly withdrew when she saw the scene unfolding. The usual rush to deplane had been suspended, replaced by something more meaningful. "That awareness," Brenda replied, "is worth more than any number of vouchers or formal apologies. It's the seed of real change." She stood slowly, reaching for her briefcase under the seat. "The question is, what will you grow from it?" Mark straightened his uniform, a gesture that seemed more about gathering strength than maintaining appearance. "I've already talked to my supervisor," he said. "Asked to lead our next crew meeting. I want to share what happened today, what I learned. If you'll permit me to tell the story." Several passengers nodded approvingly, some reaching for their phones, perhaps to make notes or send messages inspired by what they were witnessing. The businessman across the aisle had completely abandoned his usual rush to be first off the plane. "Stories are powerful things," Brenda acknowledged, adjusting her jacket. "They can change minds in ways that rules and regulations never could. Use this one wisely." She paused, then added with a slight smile, "And yes, you have my permission to share it." The gate agent's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their arrival and connection information, but it felt like background noise to the moment unfolding in first class. A baby cried somewhere in coach, the sound a reminder of life continuing beyond this bubble of understanding. "Thank you," Mark said simply, but the words carried more weight than any formal apology could have. He stepped back, making space for Brenda to move into the aisle, but remained present, engaged in this final moment. Other passengers began to stir now, reaching for bags and jackets, but their movements were different, more thoughtful, more aware. Many nodded to Brenda as they prepared to leave, not just out of respect for her position, but in acknowledgement of what her presence had taught them. The woman with the law student daughter had tears in her eyes as she gathered her things. "This was better than a semester of ethics classes," she said softly to her seatmate. "Seeing it happen, seeing someone learn and grow in real time." As passengers began to file out, Mark stood at his post, but his usual cheerful "thank you for flying with us" had been replaced by more meaningful exchanges. Each goodbye felt like a small commitment to doing better, to seeing more clearly. "I'll remember this flight," the businessman said as he passed Brenda. "And I'll make changes in my company. Real ones." His words weren't just a promise. They carried the weight of genuine intention. Sarah appeared with Brenda's coat, handling it with care, but not the exaggerated deference of earlier. She'd found a balance, a way to show respect without letting it be clouded by assumptions or fear. "Your clerk's office will be receiving some emails," Lisa added from nearby. "We've got crew members on other flights who need to hear this story, who need to understand what happened here today." Brenda shouldered her bag, preparing to leave, but taking one last look around the cabin that had become an unexpected classroom. "Understanding rarely comes from comfort," she said, loud enough for those still nearby to hear. "It comes from these moments when we're forced to see ourselves clearly." Mark stood straighter at these words, the weight of the day visible in his posture, but also a new kind of strength. The vouchers remained on the tray table, transformed from a token of apology into a reminder of growth. As the last passengers gathered their belongings, the cabin felt different than it had during boarding. It wasn't just the physical space that had changed, it was the people within it, carrying with them new awareness, new commitments to change. "Safe travels, Justice Monroe," Mark said as she prepared to leave. "And thank you," Not for the lesson I deserved, but for the one I needed. His words echoed slightly in the now empty cabin, a final acknowledgement of transformation. Brenda paused in the aisle, looking back at the seat where this journey of understanding had begun. Change isn't always about grand gestures, she said. Sometimes it's about these small moments, these quiet revelations at 35,000 feet. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the cleaning crew waited to board, casting long shadows through the space where so much had shifted in just a few hours. As Brenda walked toward the exit, she left behind not just another flight, but a catalyst for change. In Mark, in the other passengers, and in the countless lives they would touch with their newfound understanding. The airport terminal hummed with its usual evening activity as passengers dispersed from the flight, but something was different about this particular group. They moved more slowly, more thoughtfully, as if carrying the weight of newfound understanding. Brenda walked through the terminal, her heels clicking against the polished floor, aware of how the other passengers from first class kept glancing her way. Not with the usual starstruck curiosity that came with recognizing a Supreme Court justice, but with something deeper, a mix of respect and self-reflection. The businessman who'd sat across the aisle was on his phone, speaking in low, urgent tones about scheduling an emergency meeting with his HR department. "No, it can't wait until next week," she heard him say as she passed. "We need to address this now." Behind her, Mark had emerged from the plane for his break, still in his uniform but somehow looking different, as if the clothes fit him differently now. He stood at the gate desk, already deep in conversation with the supervisor he'd mentioned, gesturing earnestly as he explained what had happened. A group of flight attendants from other gates had gathered nearby, drawn by whispers of what had transpired on the flight. They watched Mark with curious expressions, some already taking notes on their phones, others nodding in recognition of situations they might have encountered themselves. Justice Monroe called out a voice, and Brenda turned to see the mother of the law student hurrying to catch up. "I just wanted to say, my daughter's facing some challenges in her program, being one of the few women of color. Would you mind if I shared your example with her? Not just your success, but how you handled today." Brenda paused, adjusting her bag on her shoulder. The terminal lights cast long shadows across the floor, mixing with the fading daylight from the large windows. "Tell her something for me," she replied. "Tell her that change doesn't always come from winning cases. Sometimes it comes from simply standing your ground with grace." Near the security checkpoint, Sarah and Lisa were ending their shifts, but instead of rushing to leave as usual, they had stopped to talk with their colleagues. Snippets of their conversation drifted through the terminal. "We need to rethink how we, and I never realized we were." The elderly gentleman who'd been sitting in the back of first class was typing furiously on his tablet, pausing occasionally to adjust his glasses. "Writing to my grandson," he explained to anyone who passed close enough to hear. "He needs to understand what I saw today, what I learned." Mark had finished his conversation with the supervisor and now stood watching the scene unfold, his expression thoughtful. The vouchers he'd tried to give Brenda were still in his pocket, but they felt different now, less like a solution and more like a reminder of how far he had to go. A young gate agent approached Brenda, clutching a clipboard. "Justice Monroe, I heard about what happened on the flight," she said hesitantly. "I'm in charge of training new staff, and would it be okay if we use this as a teaching example? Not just what went wrong, but how you helped make it right." Brenda considered the request, watching as other passengers from the flight continued to disperse through the terminal, each carrying with them a piece of what they'd witnessed. Some were already sharing the story with friends or family who'd come to pick them up, their faces animated with the importance of what they'd learned. "Use it well," Brenda replied to the gate agent. "Remember that the goal isn't to shame or punish. It's to help people see what they might have missed before." The young woman nodded earnestly, already making notes on her clipboard. The terminal's usual rush had created a stream of travelers flowing around their small group, but even some of these strangers seemed to sense something significant was happening. A few slowed their pace, catching fragments of conversations about change and awareness. By the baggage claim, the tech company employee who'd emailed his HR department was now on a video call, speaking animatedly about implementing new training protocols. "No, you don't understand," he was saying. "This isn't about checking boxes. This is about really seeing people." Mark had begun his walk to the crew room, but his path took him past where Brenda stood. He paused, maintaining a respectful distance. "I keep thinking about tomorrow's flight," he said, almost to himself. "How different it will be. How different I will be." The woman who owned the cafe with her husband was sharing the story with her staff in a group chat, her fingers flying over her phone screen. "We're having a meeting first thing tomorrow," she announced to no one in particular, "about making sure everyone feels welcome. Really welcome." Brenda checked her watch. She had a car waiting, briefs to review before tomorrow, a world of Supreme Court responsibilities to return to. But she lingered for a moment, watching the ripples of change spread through the terminal. A group of pilots walking past slowed their pace as they recognized Mark, having already heard some version of what had happened. Their expressions showed curiosity, respect, and something else, a recognition that they too might need to examine their own behaviors. "It's like watching a pebble create ripples in a pond," observed the lawyer who'd argued before Brenda years ago. He'd been quiet during the flight, but had absorbed everything. One moment, one conversation, touching so many lives. As Brenda finally turned to leave, she heard Mark's voice one last time. He was speaking to a group of new flight attendants, his words carrying clearly through the terminal. "Let me tell you about a lesson I learned today, about seeing people as they really are." The evening sun streamed through the terminal's windows, painting everything in warm, golden light. Passengers from other flights rushed past, unaware that they were moving through a space where small but significant transformations had taken root. The businessman was now standing with his driver, but instead of rushing off as planned, he was making new plans. "Cancel my first meeting tomorrow," he said firmly. "We need to start the day with a different kind of conversation." Sarah and Lisa had been joined by flight attendants from other airlines, the story already spreading beyond one carrier, beyond one flight. Their discussion was quiet but intense, focused on changes they could implement immediately. As Brenda walked toward her waiting car, she passed the gate where it had all begun. The screen still showed their flight number, a simple combination of letters and numbers that had become something more, a marker of transformation. The young law student's mother was sharing the story with her daughter via video call, tears in her eyes as she described what she'd witnessed. It wasn't just what she did, Brenda overheard. It was how she did it. With such dignity and purpose. Mark stood watching her go, the weight of the day visible in his posture, but also a new kind of strength. The vouchers remained in his pocket, no longer a token of apology, but a reminder of growth, of change, of the possibility of doing better. And Brenda? She stepped into the evening air, carrying with her not just another story of confronting bias, but hope. Hope that sometimes, in the most unexpected places, like a first-class cabin at 35,000 feet, real change could take root and grow. The airport continued its endless cycle of arrivals and departures, but for those who had shared this experience, something had shifted. They carried with them not just luggage and travel documents, but a new awareness, a commitment to see more clearly, to do better, to be better. As her car pulled away from the terminal, Brenda thought about tomorrow's Supreme Court session, about the big decisions and landmark cases waiting for her attention. But she knew that sometimes the most important changes happen not in marble courtrooms, but in these quiet moments of human connection, these small victories of understanding over ignorance, of growth over comfort. The story of what happened on that flight would continue to spread, touching lives far beyond the original passengers. And somewhere in the sky, other planes carried other travelers, each one an opportunity for the kind of change that had taken root today. One person, one moment, one revelation at a time.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.